Well, we're joined now by William Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine during the Bush and Obama administrations and former US chargé d'affaires to Ukraine under President Trump. Ambassador Taylor, always a pleasure having you on the program. First of all, I wanted to ask you about the senior Pentagon officials who are currently in Ukraine. The US Army Secretary Dan Driscoll leading a delegation, holding talks there. What's your understanding of what they're trying to achieve there?
Tom, the original purpose was to exchange views and get some information from the Ukrainians about how they're doing on the battlefield, in particular with drones. We have a lot, and the U.S. Army knows it's got a lot to learn from the Ukrainians about how to use drones, how to manufacture them, how to defend against drones. There's a lot that the Ukrainians have figured out that the U.S. Army wants to understand and adopt. But as you indicate, there's other things going on right now, and I'm sure the question about how to end this war will come up in those discussions.
Right, and one of the ways that we assume they're going to be talking about ending the war is by discussing this 28-point plan drawn up by Steve Witkoff, the US Special Envoy, but possibly with some help from a Russian envoy by the name of Kirill Dmitriev. Does that sound credible to you?
Very credible, sad to say. This does not, I think this is not a U.S. government position. It is not a U.S. government agreed document. It is a document that it clearly has all the Russian wish list. I mean, there's nothing on there that the Russians haven't asked for over and over in their maximalist demands. And that caused the U.S. government, the president and the Secretary of State, to cancel that proposed summit in Budapest a couple of weeks ago. So this is a non-starter for the Ukrainians. I think it's probably a non-starter for the Americans, and it's clearly a Witkoff-Dmitriev document.
And why hasn't Ukraine been involved in the drafting of that document up until now? And why have the European powers, do you think, all been apparently blindsided by it?
Because this is not the main channel. This is not the official U.S. work on this project. The official U.S. work on this project is under Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and it will have, and indeed already has had, input from the Ukrainians and from the Europeans. As I say, this document is not endorsed by the U.S. government, and so it didn't benefit from the normal process of talking to the Ukrainians and the Europeans. So that will come in when they get to a serious work, unlike this 28-point plan, which is not serious in my view. When they get to the serious work, the Ukrainians and the Europeans will have strong views.
So you're saying this 28-point plan doesn't really stand much of a chance?
It stands no chance. There is no chance. The Americans don't. People that I've talked to in the U.S. government don't know about this and are surprised by it. The Ukrainians will reject it out of hand. They will be polite. The Ukrainians will say, very interesting, but look, here's a counter proposal. Here's a better idea. And the Europeans will never accept it as well. So no, it's not a real proposal.
Do you think there's an argument that perhaps they've brought this up now because Zelenskyy is looking vulnerable because there's been yet another corruption scandal in the ranks of his senior officials? Do you think that somehow weakened his hand with the US, and that's why they've decided to put this plan to him now?
Again, I don't think the Americans are putting this plan to him. I don't think this is a real plan from the United States. But you're absolutely right. The Russians love the fact that President Zelenskyy has this crisis, has this difficulty. President Zelenskyy is trying to get through that, and he is putting some pressure on his team to clean this up. But the Russians are going to make the most of this crisis.
Okay, I mean, there isn't anything that we've heard from the Russians that sounds like a concession. Have you spotted anything or heard anything that sounds remotely concession-like from them?
Not remotely concession-like, not remotely at all. This 28-point plan is very similar and almost identical to what Putin has been saying all along. That is, the Ukrainians can't have to cut their army in half. The Russian language, Russian Orthodox Church, no assistance from the Americans or the Europeans. This is a Russian wish list. This is not a serious proposal.
And, there could be an argument as well that, a proposal like this, if indeed it didn't bring about a lasting peace, would have the effect of encouraging Russia to perhaps look around for its next land grab. What do you say to that?
Again, the Ukrainians will never accept this. And sure, if the Russians somehow were to impose this, again, they won't be able to, but if hypothetically, yes, if they were able to take over Ukraine, then yes, the Baltic states, Moldova, even other members of NATO are in jeopardy. Moldova, of course, not a member of NATO yet, but the Baltic states are, and there are some other vulnerable nations that the Russians would threaten.
Ambassador Taylor, isn't Dan Driscoll going to have some quite tricky questions to answer when he gets back to Washington if he's been doing something that sounds like it's completely off-brand and totally outside of his remit?
Dan Driscoll's not. The Secretary of the Army is not. Witkoff, I think, is going to have some real problems when he goes back to Washington. Dan Driscoll is there as the Secretary of the Army with two very senior generals, and they are there, as I say, to talk about drones and talk about what the Ukrainians have learned about this new fight against the Russians. And you're right, he's going to have some hard questions, I'm sure, from the Ukrainians about this purported 28-point plan. And I imagine the Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, is going to say, you know, this is not a U.S. government proposal. Stand by for a real proposal.
Okay, so there's sort of, the idea is perhaps to just test the waters and see, you know, how it goes down. Is that basically the idea?
I think that may give Witkoff too much credit. I think he is freelancing. I think he is, he probably didn't even leak this. It's probably the Russians that leaked this 28-point plan. Again, this is not a U.S. government position. This is Witkoff and Dmitriev having conversations about what Dmitriev and what Putin would like to see. This, again, we should not give any credibility to this 28-point plan.
Yeah, because I mean, what struck me when I was reading about this plan is that the Trump administration has encouraged and succeeded in getting NATO member states to commit to spending 5% of GDP on defense by the year 2035, and then to go appeasing Russia by giving it everything it wants when it invades not a NATO member state, but a border state and an allied state. I mean, it sends very conflicting messages, doesn't it?
Very conflicting messages, and therefore I think we have to discount this discordant message, this 28-point plan. But you're right, President Trump's put some serious sanctions on the Russians, the two largest oil companies. He put big sanctions on 2 weeks ago. It's already having an effect. He has also put secondary tariffs on the Indians for buying Russian oil. He's still thinking about whether or not to provide the Tomahawk weapons, long-range cruise missiles to the Ukrainians. So no, President Trump is still very hard on the Russians. There is strong support for Ukraine in the U.S. Congress. I mean, you've talked a lot, I'm sure, about the Graham bill with 85 co-sponsors that puts real serious sanctions on the Russians and purchases of Russian oil. So, yes, there's a strong support for Ukraine in the administration and here in Washington. And this 28-point plan is outside of that.
President Trump, as we all know, is a transactional president and he likes doing deals. And now that we're in a situation where European countries are the ones paying for the weaponry being sent to Ukraine, even if the origin of that weaponry is the United States. I mean, isn't that quite a good deal for the Americans, and perhaps one that's actually turning out to be quite a good money spinner, without meaning to sound crass?
It is a good deal. It is a good deal. President Trump gets to say to many people that he's not spending U.S. money, U.S. taxpayers' money anymore. He is allowing the Europeans and the Ukrainians to buy weapons from U.S. manufacturers. That's a good thing. And there's this $300 billion worth of Russian central bank reserves that can go to fund these purchases of U.S. weapons. So this is going in the right direction.
Okay, so if we have established that this 28-point plan is simply one man's work, but it doesn't represent the position of the US government, what's your view of what should be done next to somehow bring about an end to this war? Do you see the Ukrainians having to volunteer to make concessions of one kind or another, to give up land? What do you think is going to happen in the months ahead?
I don't see them having to make concessions. I do see President Trump using the leverage that he's got over Putin to bring him to the conclusion that he cannot win. Putin is going to come to the realization that the economic pressure, the sanctions, the tariffs on purchasers of Russian oil, the provision of $300 billion to the Ukrainians to keep them going for the next 3 years, the weapons that are going to continue to flow to Ukraine, that is what's going to put pressure on Putin to say, I can't win this one. I'm going to have to get out of this somehow and stop the fight. That's what's going to have to happen. And then, yes, they'll probably freeze along the current line. The Russians will continue to illegally occupy 19% of Ukraine, but the 81% of Ukraine is not occupied will go to the EU. And the Ukrainians will say they'll get back that last 19%, the 19% that the Russians clearly continually occupy, illegally occupy, that will come back. Just like West Germany never gave up on getting back East Germany, and they eventually got it.
One of our earlier guests, we spoke to Dmitry Markov, Sergei Markov, I should say, who is a former spokesperson for President Putin. And he said to us that all Ukrainians actually wanted to be part of Russia and that they viewed President Zelenskyy as being a dictator, a Nazi, and he used many other descriptions. When you were based there, did you hear many Ukrainians expressing their desire to be part of Russia?
That is, no, of course not. Of course not. What the Russians have done is create a unified, hostile nation on their border. When they invaded in 2014, and then when they invaded again in 2022, big time, that consolidated the Ukrainians against the Russians, and that hatred and that hostility for Russia will persist for generations. Putin has made a major mistake, and that fantastical thinking that you heard from them, that's what made Putin make this mistake to invade, this blunder to invade. This is the biggest mistake he's ever made, he could have made, and that's because he thought that the Ukrainians really wanted to be Russians. That couldn't be farther from the truth, could not be farther from the truth.
So you never heard one Ukrainian say to you, I'd actually rather be Russian?
Nope, never had.
Okay. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. William Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Tom.